I myself have a very, 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 very small connection to the first story that I'm very excited to share with you. Although the subject matter does require a content warning because it does involve a lot of violence and death. And so we're going to begin our local news segment talking about an international news story. We're going to talk a little bit about a man named Awdah Hathaleen, who was a 31-year-old Palestinian Bedouin activist who lived in the West Bank. Just last month, he was actually trying to visit the United States to speak about some of the different political struggles going on in his village in the West Bank. And he was denied entry into the U.S. Through SFO. So he tried to enter through SFO, and he was stopped there by immigration, and he was deported back to the West Bank. And shortly after he was deported, he was killed. He was assassinated in his community of the West Bank by a settler, by a member of the Israeli military. At present, not only he was killed, but I think 7 other men in his family were immediately detained by Israeli forces, and now they're being detained, while 60 women from his village are engaging in an ongoing hunger strike right now because the Israeli military is also refusing to give up his body. The Israeli military's thinking is that his body can be a sign of resistance, right? So they won't release his body back without strict conditions. So he can only have a funeral at night. He can only have a funeral procession of about 15 people or so. And so basically, it's essentially to make sure that his funeral can't become a point of Palestinian resistance. And so I think the connection here to our program is that I actually got to meet Awdah in July of 2023 when I was visiting the West Bank of Palestine. I still remember hearing him speak and sort of describe the experience of the Bedouin people in Palestine through the atrocities of 48 and 67. And so, I want to open this up to have a little bit more conversation. But I think, one of the things that I want to share my first impression of Awdah Hathaleen. When I first met Awdah, the first thing that kind of struck me was that he was burned. His body was pretty significantly burned. He was covered in old burn scars. He's a man just a little younger than myself, but his body was just burned. His face was burned. He didn't have eyebrows on his face, because his skin was so badly burned. He was burned, he was scarred, and he was beautiful. He was a very eloquent, soft-spoken man, educated, and, very passionate about his people, and he got to share with me about the history of his village, the history of Palestinian Bedouins specifically, and some of the struggles that they'd fought just to get to have roofs over their heads, because the Israeli military not only just oppresses the Palestinians, but really does specifically oppress the Bedouins, to where the average Bedouin has to see their home be bulldozed 3-4 times a year, often by Israeli military. Even just the ability to have a roof, even during peacetime, is a very difficult thing for the Palestinian Bedouin community to have. So, yeah, this is our first story. I'm curious, Dale. I know you've heard some of this news coverage. I'm kind of curious where your head's at on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's another tragedy, and what's been a lot of that happening in the past couple of years, and throughout the entire occupation of Palestine. As unique and as tragic as his individual story is, it's also not anything different than what a lot of other people experience. And I think one thing that comes up for me in particular is it's interesting that, and this certainly isn't the only case where they're refusing to give his family, his community back his body, because they see even that as them having control over how they choose to, bring somebody to rest, and also really demonstrate to everybody why it's important that we honor martyrs, we honor people who were killed unjustly, during this occupation, during this genocide. And it's in some ways it is ironic, think about in the aftermath of October 7th, when there were all these really ridiculous stories going out there, and then people were like, okay, well, where's the evidence? And we saw the IDF. It's we had to bury, a lot of these people immediately in order to be, in line with what is considered Jewish burial customs, and it's well, you get to have that, but yet Palestinians can't have this. It's disgusting, and it's, like they say, every, I forget what the saying is exactly in this moment, but every time they make an accusation, it's a confession. I think that's it, and I think it also brings up, another important point with him being Bedouin is the fact that, we think about, what a free Palestine might look like in the future. But even in Palestinian society today, it is, quite diverse in many ways. There are many people who practice many different religions, people from many different cultural and ethnic groups, and people from different classes as well. Palestine is a class society. There are lots of books out there that talk about how before the early colonization of Palestine by these Western European settler colonialists, these Zionists, there were still like the early stages of class society. There was a peasantry, there were, landlords, there were capitalists, and these things, evolve over time like any society does, but no, I think it's powerful hearing how you had this brief experience with him in your time on the West Bank, and I think it's important to recognize that he's not just another face, just another person. He was a person, and he meant something, and that's why we're bringing this up now. So.
And I think his work was also like a big part of what ultimately got him killed, right? Because obviously, he was a local leader in his community, but it also was like a developing as a national and international leader, I would say. He was featured in the film No Other Land. Yep. So he'd already developed like his message and his work, bringing awareness to the Palestinian Bedouin community was reaching a higher and higher profile, and so it's very important that we see that his deportation from the United States was very much not just it's not just a Trump policy against immigrants. It's very much a U.S. policy on imperialism, right? That these like anti-imperialist fighters in particular have to be killed. And I think we also have to draw common cause with the Israeli tactics, because I think sort of what we talked about in like our last episode, with some of the recent political things going, political assassinations going on in places like India, or the same situation now with like getting Chairman Dada's body was also a pretty significant point of political struggle, where the Indian government did not want to release this martyr's bodies for fear that their funeral processions would themselves become a point of resistance. Yeah. So we see like these common threads along these different anti-imperialist struggles, and these imperialists, whether it be in India or Palestine or over here in the United States, like they often use very similar tactics. And so, I think I'm just kind of, I feel like it's important that we talk a little bit more about, like, I think this whole idea of who are these Bedouins? Because I think that's an important kind of piece here that I think isn't really often talked about. I think kind of the nature of how we can sort of come into consciousness of these anti-imperialist struggles, we often can get very, very flat understanding of the situation, sort of like what you're describing, Dale. Is Palestine a class society or not? That's like a not necessarily a point of contention, but of serious confusion in a lot of these different solidarity movements, and how we understand these things like colonialism. Is it colonialism or is it capitalism? Well, my friends, it's both, unfortunately. Yeah. But going back to specifically Palestine, Awdah was from what's called a Bedouin community. The Bedouins are, a very large, cultural, national, ethnic, linguistic identity within the Arab people, right? Like anthropologically, I think some would say all Arabs at one point in prehistory were like, migratory peoples. But the Bedouins are distinct from, a lot of other Arab peoples. They're often considered, some Bedouin communities are considered Arab, some are more considered Berber, right? There's other different, they're not just a specific like racial group. And they also often, in many places, try to maintain their traditional ways of life, like their migratory ways of life, their methods of animal husbandry, their different dialect, their different manners of dress, and so that often puts them at odds, not just with the Zionists, but often like the different mainstream Arab societies, right? They often aren't quite as either at the periphery of them or might face some different degree of exploitation. Yeah. And I think when we think of like the oppression of the Palestinian people, the Bedouins actually get some of the worst oppression, actually, because their positions are always so temporary as pastoralists, as migratory people. Yeah. So a lot of these land grabs are have been incredibly harsh onto the Bedouin people, for instance, because of their ways of life. They're particularly vulnerable. And so I just one particular example is like for Palestinian people living in the West Bank, for people living in the occupied territories under direct Zionist occupation, there's still some basic expectation of social services, that makes sense, right? People still have to exist in an apartheid society, but when people turn their sinks on, they still have the basic expectation that the water will come out, right? That the Zionists will still allow water to come out most of the time, with many, many, many exceptions. But for the Bedouins, they don't even have that basic assurance to even have running water. That's how little the Israeli government gives them. They refuse to even give them water. So when I was touring through Awdah's village, he was making a big Umar al Khair is the name of the village, if I'm getting that correctly, was just like the basic struggles they had just to get basic utilities. That there's a water pipe, but the Israeli military would only allow water to throw through it either 40 minutes to an hour a day. So just really abysmal conditions that they're fighting with, where they have to have water storage tanks. And then, we'll clip some of the photos that I took when I was out there, but you can see some of the various conditions. A lot of them, they maintain a very traditional lifestyle, not necessarily in the sense that, we want to maintain a traditional, Berber lifestyle, but really the fact that the Israeli military won't let us have permanent residences. They won't let us build and engage in regular construction like in the rest of society. So, yeah, it's pretty serious stuff. And then, their village, Khair, is also really adjacent to a very militant canton of settlers. I use canton, not community, because we shouldn't forget that these settlers are not civilians. They are part of the Israeli armed forces.
Absolutely. A lot of them will straight up start antagonizing in their regular clothes and then go back home and get their uniforms and be like, now you really got to get the fuck out of here.
Yeah. So, his village, in the struggle of Bedouins, it's really right on this razor edge of the everyday struggle of the Palestinian people. And so I think that's it's just important to sort of understand when we see how this struggle was going on. It was very important for me to sort of be led through his village and show, because they show even the ruins of when they first were displaced into that area. Because I think in 1948, the Negev Desert was another big point of contention, right? So the Zionists actually claim most of what's called the Negev Desert, where a lot of the Bedouin people live. And so that immediately pushed them, changed their way of life pretty immediately, obviously for all Palestinians, particularly as migratory people. That kind of slowly came to a stop, very abruptly after 48, even more so after 67. And so, so when they first were displaced into a lot of these areas where they live, immediately in the south of the West Bank, there's a big issue of them just being given nothing, right? Even having no rights to actually build and even have tents. So they described the first efforts, they have to even just digging caves into the ground so they can have some basic level of shelter. And then they come by, and the Awdah, he shows us to a big pit in the ground. And he explains that, shortly after they built their first caves and they first came to this area, the Israeli military came through and collapsed the caves. They wouldn't even let them dig holes in the ground to shelter themselves.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, so that's a struggle they've been dealing with over 70 years,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up, as well, with them being a pastoral community and that being their traditional way of life, but also not having the basic access to the basic amenities, which a lot of Palestinians are already denied in a lot of ways. Both of the major aquifers that are in that area are in Gaza and the West Bank, yet they're controlled by Israel. And I think it's, this has been happening for over half a century at least, I think since the late 60s and whatnot. And, I'm imagine a lot of people watching this are in line with, what we're saying, that this is a genocide. This has been a genocide longer than what happened a couple years ago. But the UN does clearly state that denying people the right to water is grounds for genocide. People need water to drink to live. So it's there's a lot of, there's a lot in this as well. I think looking into the fact that, as a pastoral society, there would still probably be some tension that they might experience, trying to go into neighboring countries as well, because there's definitely a lot of, countries that are in line with Israel, even though they might try and prop up this idea that they're pro-Palestinian liberation. They still strike trade deals with them because it's advantageous. And oftentimes we see these very arbitrary, borders as they're constructed, really getting in the way of people's traditional ways of lives. We'll kind of get into a little bit more later in this episode. But yeah, I think it's important to, not just paint over what people are going through in these situations with just broad strokes. We have to get into the nuance to really like understand, like in particular, like how certain groups of people experience oppression and how like, this plays into our broader like understanding and analysis of a particular situation when we're trying to really fight for, true like international solidarity and liberation for oppressed people. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we need to wrap up this segment, but I think I want to close this out with one. I think everyone should check the link in the description and really look into some of the work of Awdah Hathaleen. We can link his village's Instagram page. They have their own Instagram page, this little Bedouin village, and so you can see some of the stuff that Awdah was fighting for.